Hi, everyone. It's me, Tim. Today I want to talk about teaching. I want to talk about teaching in terms of what lessons I learned by teaching and kind of how I applied some of those lessons to game development. I've mentioned that I was in graduate school for 4 years, 4.5, from late 87 to mid 91. And during the time as a graduate student, I was at University of California, Irvine, UCI, their School of Information and Computer Science. During those 4 years, I had to be a teaching assistant. They will pay you to be a TA. And I TA'd a lot of classes. I TA'd programming languages, basic. I TA'd operating systems, and that's one I actually really liked. I TA'd operating systems 3 times because I really liked the professor, Stephen Franklin, and it was taught at 8 in the morning, and it was an optional class. So it was full of students who really wanted to be there because they didn't need to be, and it was 8 in the morning. So it kind of weeded out people who didn't want to learn about operating systems. But one class I had to teach was on neural networks. And I knew that it was going to be assigned to me. It was coming up. And I had never had a class. My undergraduate degree at the University of Virginia did not include neural networks. So I studied neural networks. I had already kind of dove into them a little bit because I was at UCI to get a PhD in AI. So I dove into neural networks lightly, but I went in deep dive because I did not want to TA a class I didn't know about. What I loved about it was I stayed ahead of the students, and it was a good class. And after it was over, I was having lunch with the other TA, and I turned to him and I said, "Could you tell that I myself have never had a class in neural networks?" And he was like, "What?" He goes, "I heard you explaining things, hidden layers and feedback." And I was like, "Yep, I learned all that within the last 6 months." So that was interesting. I've subsequently gone back and taught game development classes at UCI. I have a video about it. I went back in 99 and then again in 2000. And I taught classes there. And I really enjoyed it. And since then, I've gone to conferences and given talks on game development. I've done this channel. What I love about teaching in general, and true for all those things, is it forces you to really think and examine the process that you're talking about. Sometimes you just do things. You just do them. You don't think about it, but having to explain it to another person, meaning you have to go back and think about all the things you just did, and you have to collect them together, you have to organize it, and you have to codify it. So along the way, all those different teaching things I did, from being a TA to going back to teaching classes to going to conferences to doing this channel, I have been forced to learn things as I taught. I had to think about ways my thoughts on game development has changed over the years. Because if someone asks me a question, and I start answering, I'd be like, well, this is how I used to do it, but now I do it this way, and it's because the old way caused these problems, and I couldn't figure out a solution to those problems, and the new way doesn't have those problems. And every now and then, I find myself talking to someone and go, oh, well, did you try solving it this way? And my common answer is, where were you 20 years ago? Because that's a really good solution. I also have to talk about where I failed. That is a common question. I got it both years I taught at UCI. People said, well, what did you ever mess up? And I have a whole video about lessons I learned from failure. And I think it's important to think about where you failed. Because that whole video is about how I think you learn more from failure than success. Failure will teach you, but only if you pay attention to it. If you don't pay attention to it, then you're in that standard, people who don't pay attention to history are doomed to repeat it. If you don't pay attention to why you're failing, you will continue to fail. So you have to really examine your failure and accept it, and then do something different next time. I think when I examine my game development, I have to divide it into ways that I think are better and ways I prefer. Because some of the ways I prefer aren't necessarily better, they're just more comfortable to me, they come easier to me. But occasionally I'm like, but this other way's better, and it's going to be a lot more work for me, and I don't think that way. That's when I often try to find someone to work with. Or if I'm a director, I try to find leads that are good in those other ways, that reinforce what I'm bad at, or reinforce what I'm not. I can be good at it, but I don't like going that direction. We all have a way we like to steer, and I'm like, I don't tend to steer this way. I get someone who's like, let's steer that way. We're going to that island. Sometimes though, your preference boils down to the difference between how you like to develop a game and how you like to play it. And you have to keep those separate. Sometimes the game development process requires you to play the game in ways you don't like. If you watch my video on all the different ways I played Outer Worlds, there were ways I played that game that were not natural to me, and I didn't even like playing them that way. But I understood that you have to play them that way because you're trying to make a game that will appeal to more people and is solvable under different player builds. So you have to separate, this is how I like to develop versus here's how I like to play. Because sometimes you're going to make a game that's playable in ways you don't like to play. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, I've run into a few similar things that remind me of teaching and what I've learned from teaching. One of them is paired programming. Paired programming is when either when you're doing code or you're debugging code or optimizing code, you sit down with another programmer and you do it together. What's interesting about paired programming is having to explain your code to another knowledgeable programmer is very eye-opening. Because sometimes the programmer will just ask very fundamental, basic questions like, well, why are you using that sort? Why are you keeping it in a linked list rather than an array? You know, just basically like, why are you doing this algorithm? Why are you using this data structure? And sometimes you can explain it like, oh, well, we have this many items come in, or it's resorted on a regular basis, or blah, blah. And sometimes you go to explain it and you realize the way I'm doing it isn't the best thing for how this is being used. And so you end up rewriting it. And you never would have done that if you hadn't sat down and tried to explain what you were doing to another programmer. And also, by the way, sometimes when you're really stuck trying to find a bug in a chunk of code, you know it's in a chunk of code, sometimes just rewriting it a whole new way will let you fix the bug without ever knowing what the bug was. And sometimes it lets you fix the bug faster than if you had looked for the bug. Just rewrite the code and the bug disappears. Interesting stuff. And then something that I don't have kids, but has been told to me that parenting is very similar to teaching in the sense that it will rapidly reveal what you don't know. Because your kids will ask you lots of questions about lots of things, some of which you only know very surface, very, very informally. And then they will also ask you about things that you suddenly realize you don't know. I don't know what the difference between those two things are. I don't know why we call it that. I don't know where that came from. I used to do that with my mom all the time. I was apparently asked her questions all the time, which is why she loved the fact that we had a complete encyclopedia set. And she'd go, why don't you go look it up? I don't know. Why don't you go look that up? And then you tell me. Which meant I now have like a little assignment, which kept me busy and thankfully out of her hair, because she had 4 other kids to deal with. I would go off, I'd pull an encyclopedia book out, I'd read it, I'd think about it, and I'd go back to her and I'm like, well, I think the reason is this. So let me tell you about the one other big lesson I learned by teaching. And this lesson pervades all my videos, so it's not going to be a shocker to you. Be very afraid of someone who acts like they know everything, and especially someone who's always right. They're always right in all their stories. They never do anything wrong. They always knew ahead of time that something was the best way. The reason you should be afraid of them is nobody's like that. So basically, they're glossing over something bad. What I like to do is what I learned from teaching. When I taught both years at UCI, there was some student in the class who went, can you talk about something you did wrong? Can you talk about code that you made that was really bad, or a design that you had to redo? And those are good questions, and I have answers to those. I done videos on those. So what I love to always ask someone is, how did you mess up? Can you tell me some story where you really messed up and you messed up bad, and then how did you fix it? Because if they can't answer that question, and their answer doesn't include some ownership, so not like, well, one time I did this, but I did it because someone else told me to, and then we had to go back and change it. If they don't own it, if they don't say, I did this thing and it was completely wrong, I messed up, I had to fix it. So if they can't think of something they did wrong and they own it, run away from that person, because that's somebody who at some point is going to be right about something that is very wrong. And that was not only something I learned by teaching, but it's something I like to tell the students too, which is, there's a lot for you to learn. I don't know everything. You're not going to know everything. Just own up when you mess up and do it a new way. So anyway, that's my thoughts on teaching, and I hope you liked it.